Welcome to another instalment of Insight Vox, UK Column News's series of interviews with distinguished guests. Today I'll be talking to Peter Ford, who was formerly Her Majesty's Ambassador in both Bahrain and Syria, first in Bahrain from 1999 to 2003, and then more in the public eye from Syria from 2003 to 2006. It's his comments on the Syrian government and our relationship with the Syrian government since his having left office in 2006, which have brought him to public notice. He went on from 2006 to serve as 8 years as the representative in the Arab world of the Commission General of UNRWA, or UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, a subject he became familiar with, of course, particularly in his years serving in Damascus. Peter, you're very welcome this afternoon.
Thank you.
I'd like to start off by asking you about your formative years and how it was that you ended up in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I have a sense that I know something of the values with which you were raised simply by dint of the fact that you were born within a week of my mother and geographically very close as well in Cheshire. So you were of that vintage baby boom year of 1947, and you went to school at what was then still a grammar school, alas no longer, at Helsby, just outside Runcorn. And you, I think, developed an interest for the great abroad and for languages at that time. So tell us something about the values you were raised with at school, and particularly, given that you'd ended up being a diplomat, what view did you and children growing up at the same time as you have of the foreign and diplomatic service and of Britain's role in the world?
Well, I grew up with a rather different background to most members of the Foreign Office, at least of my generation. At the time I joined, most people had been to public school and had a rather aristocratic, or at least middle class background. I had a working class background from the north of England, as you mentioned. And I think I took some of those values with me into the Foreign Office. I didn't immediately, or perhaps ever, feel quite like I fitted. Nevertheless, the Foreign Office at the time did welcome eccentrics. I remember one of my colleagues who would regularly be seen at parties with a parrot on his shoulder. I'm afraid those days are long past, and what you have now are conformists. But to go back to my formative years, I was the first person from my family to go to university, the first to go to Oxford, obviously the first to get a first-class degree at Oxford, and the first to enter the civil service, the first to enter the Foreign Office. It was, in some ways, a natural progression for someone whose interest in the wider world had been fired by his father, who was in the Navy in the Second World War and who visited places like Alexandria and Algiers. That fired my imagination, particularly about the Middle East, so that by the time I went to Oxford, my thoughts were already turning towards a diplomatic career. It was a long shot. The odds were stacked high against someone from my background getting through, but with a bit of luck and hard work, I did get through.
I was particularly interested to see that the motto of what was then Helsby Grammar School is Ut tibi sic aliis, which is the golden rule: do unto others as you would be done by. And I noticed that a lot of schools these days do seem to have changed their mottos, or newly founded ones have brought in mottos which say more or less actualize yourself, achieve as much as you can from your own potential. And yet the whole belt of grammar schools, which you and my parents and many others like them were raised in the baby boom era, was a late Victorian ethos. I think your school was founded in those years as well, of do the best you can for your fellow man and do right by him, which is something that you have underlined, I think, in the way that you have called on the British government actually to behave sensibly towards the Arab world and the Syrians. You seem to be quite a lone voice in that amongst your peers. Do you think it is fair to say that there has been a growth in selfishness and introspection in society, and particularly in the ranks of those who are joining now the civil service and the diplomatic service?
Those are deep questions, Alex, and I'm not sure we've got enough time to do justice to them. I'm not even sure that I am best equipped to pontificate. But what I have observed is a growing trend towards materialism, growing importance of commercial interests in the calculations of the Foreign Service, and less interest in what we might call ethical issues, and also a deplorable tendency towards a managerial approach, so that you have now in the Foreign Office a director for change management, but you no longer have a director for strategic affairs.
And that, in fact, was one of the major departments, I remember, even as late as the early 2000s, was the strategic affairs. And other considerations like SecPol, Security Policy Department, seem to have gained the upper hand, as you say. Well, I've got a few quotations here that you have of interviews that you have given recently, which illustrate to our viewers something of your attitude. Particularly interesting is that this month, April 2017, you told the Middle East Eye that you began to dissent from British government policy while you were still ambassador in Damascus. So these are the 3 years after the invasion of Iraq. Quote, "We showed no understanding for Syria's behavior vis-a-vis Iraq. I was under regular instructions, you say, to remonstrate with the Syrians over the flow of jihadis into Iraq, which I honestly did. But I could understand the Syrian viewpoint. They were worried that after the fall of Saddam, they were going to be next. The Americans were virtually advertising the fact that Assad was on their hit list and that he would be next. So it made sense for the Syrians to put spokes in the wheel and keep the Americans bogged down. The British government, you say to the Middle East Eye, had showed no understanding of this and just slavishly followed the American line." What is the root of the American and British establishment's dislike of not the Arab world in general, but of the Ba'ath philosophy in particular, which Iraq and Syria have had, and now Syria is trying to cling on to? For our viewers who are maybe less versed, Syria was one of the leading pan-Arabist countries in the late 50s and went in with Nasserism into a united Arab republic, which didn't last very long. What is it about the Arab nationalism of the decades since then that the powers that be in Washington and London particularly dislike?
First of all, more broadly, it's a result of political or diplomatic autism, an inability to see the other person's point of view, or even consider that they might have one, on the spectrum of diplomatic autism. The Foreign Office and Washington are off the graph. But to address your question more specifically, why did they take against the secular autocratic regimes? Well, because they were defiant. Unlike the monarchical autocratic regimes of the Gulf, they didn't actually challenge the West. But regimes like Libya, Iraq, and Syria did. The way they saw it, they were only defending their own interests. But on the British and American side, as I mentioned, there was an inability to see this. And therefore, George Bush said it all, didn't he, in the run-up to Iraq? You're either with us or against us. Well, some of these regimes, particularly the Syrian, have been rather proud. They have, in the case of Syria, thousands of years of history, not just a few decades of Ba'athist rule, and kneeling, falling into line as the Gulf monarchical regimes were happy to do, didn't come easily to them. We can't ignore either the fact that these secular regimes were rather hostile towards Israel, whereas the countries of the Gulf, the kingdoms, the feudal kingdoms, although they might use some bluster about Israel, they never seriously lifted a finger against Israel. Syria, which had some of its own land occupied by Israel, very definitely did, not least through its support for the Lebanese resistance in the shape of Hezbollah.
Now, one of the things which brought you to prominence in the last year or so, well, 2 years ago, I think, when David Cameron was still Prime Minister, so 2015 or prior, perhaps even the 2013 failed attempt to attack Syria on the ground, is that you warned Mr. Cameron publicly that he would, quote, have blood on his hands if Mr. Assad was toppled, because you warned quite simply that the Christians of Syria would be massacred if we invaded and toppled Assad. I noticed that one of the few people who carried that on their websites was the local Roman Catholic diocese where you are, the Diocese of Shrewsbury. Who in the British government and in the British establishment cares about the Syrians of the Middle East, the Christians of the Middle East, and particularly the Christians of Syria? Syria, of course, like Lebanon, has a very substantial Christian population of 12 historic denominations, doesn't it? They don't seem to have any sympathy that I can see in the government, and perhaps not even in the Foreign Office.
Our government and the American administration try to airbrush the Syrian Christians out of the picture. They ignore them and they try to suppress their side of the story. For example, the British government last November refused visas to Syrian bishops who wish to come to speak to members of parliament. This is utterly shameful. This is suppression of free speech, and it's anti-Christian discrimination. But of course, it's not fashionable these days to take up that, to advocate for Christian rights. I'm not a practicing Christian myself, but I have a lot of respect for the Syrian Christians who indeed face a dreadful fate of beheading, massacre, at best ethnic cleansing, if David Cameron and people who think like him got their way. This has been the fate of Christians in many places in Iraq and Syria when the Islamists have taken over villages and towns.
And indeed, just this last weekend, we had a hideous bombing of refugee buses in Kathria and Al-Fu'a, two Shia enclave villages in the northwest towards the border with Turkey around Hatay. What is it that makes the Shia take such a hammering from Islamic State, to the extent that one of the men, more or less standing directly in front of the bodies of smouldering children, was waving his finger and saying, "This is what you get for being an Iranian heretic"? Even from his point of view as a Sunni, supposed Sunni Muslim, he was saying that these people are heathen and don't even belong in the Arab world. I'm particularly interested whether you see a wider picture, because you previously served in Bahrain, which, if I'm not wrong, is a majority Shia country ruled by a Sunni absolute monarchy. We hear a lot of claims about the Sunni-Shia relationship and the West's involvement therein. What is it that causes the current combatants in Syria to loathe the Shia as much as the Christians?
Indeed, this is the nub of the question. This is what the Syrian conflict is basically about. You have a Sunni majority of about 74% of the population, and they find it very difficult to accept that they don't have an ascendancy as they do in the other countries of the Middle East, where they have a numerical majority. And they, in particular, cannot live with the fact that the president is an Alawite, a member of a minority sect. I used to serve in Riyadh, and I saw at firsthand the depths of prejudice and loathing towards Shiites who tend to be seen by Wahhabis as heretics and infidels. It's this takfiri mentality, this tendency to claim that other Muslims are not really Muslims at all, but infidels, which lies at the base of the barbarism of ISIS, the ideology of Al-Qaeda, and much of the conflict that's going on in Syria. But apropos of the incident that you just mentioned, the atrocity when the Shia evacuees were bombed by a suicide bomber, I was struck by the way that the rebels were airbrushed out of the picture by the mainstream media in their reporting. You of the incident, you had to go down to about paragraph 14 to get any idea that these were pro-government people who had been bombed by rebels or some individuals supportive of the rebels. And indeed, the BBC on their website had their own correspondent in Beirut insinuating that the government was behind this, as though the Assad government could call on squadrons of suicide bombers when there's not a single person who would lay down their life or be asked to lay down their life for the Assad government.
And yet, at the same time as the media in the West is fudging the issue of who is responsible for the massacres of Shia and Christians and Alawites and Druze, we have John McCain, of course, who contended for the US presidency. The younger viewers might not remember that. He's openly admitting that what the Syrians with Russian Federation support now are resisting is, quote, CIA-run operations in Syria. He's openly saying that the Russians and Assad's government and army are treating these US lackeys, we could call them, with disdain and contempt, his words. And he even talked about our Free Syrian Army. Does our Free Syrian Army, his wording there, indicate that there is no such thing on the ground as the Free Syrian Army? And perhaps I'm reading too much into the Arabic of the name of ISIS or ISIL as well, but it strikes me that they're almost a franchise or a foreign-run operation, in that even their title, Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, fi Iraq wa Sham in Arabic, implies that they have been given license to run a franchise of that notion in the territory of Iraq and Levant, just like last decade we had the Islamic Emirate, so-called, of the North Caucasus on Russian territory, clearly being run by Turkey and NATO.
I don't want to be drawn into conspiracy theories, but let me say this, that if the Americans had wanted to encourage Daesh, they wouldn't have gone about it any other way than to unseat Saddam, sow mayhem in Iraq, seek to destabilize Syria, and now to build up phony mercenary armies. I dare say that may not have been their conscious intention, but in terms of results, the Americans have certainly favored the growth and expansion of Daesh.
Now, as well as pointing out the immorality of our policy in Syria, you've also pointed out its rank stupidity. You were on BBC The Big Question not long ago, and you've said that our Syria policy is, quote, incoherent and grotesque, and that we're like a dog returning to its vomit, quoting that biblical proverb, really, of how foolish we are being here. And on the issue of radicalization of British Muslims, you've pointed out quite cogently that the British government shouldn't be surprised if we find some of our young Muslims leaving Britain to fight in Syria for Daesh or whatever franchises they have there, because you said that all they're doing is taking at face value the government's call in Britain for the overthrow of the secular Syrian government. So with all this folly going on, what's in it for the British government? Or is there a small group of people within the British government or overlapping in membership with the British government who are causing the tail to wag the dog?
Well, strangely, the British government is beginning to sound like Daesh. Just this week, Boris Johnson spoke about the need to decapitate Assad. Decapitate Assad. Think about it in the context. Who goes about decapitating in the Middle East at the moment? Daesh, I think. Boris Johnson also resorts to demonizing Assad constantly as the butcher. Well, it's no surprise if many young Muslims hearing this language about decapitation and butchers take it rather literally and think that they should go out there and join the Islamist Foreign Legion, which is how they tend to see Daesh. And I think there's some hypocrisy on the part of the British government to put them in jail sometimes for doing that, when all they're doing is heeding government pronouncements.
An element that you have come across, and I, in a humble way as well, as a former GCHQ officer, which we can't really go into detail about, but we ought to mention because it's publicly avowed sometimes, is the role of what's commonly called MI6, properly speaking, the Secret Intelligence Service, or again, perhaps a clique of officers within that, because you and I have both, I'm sure, worked with dozens of extremely good SIS officers with fluent Arabic, Russian, and what have you, who mean nothing but good. But we do see a kind of trend here that in the 2 or 3 years before we have open militaristic talk by the British and American governments against a country, there is a precursor period where SIS appears to be targeting the opposition to sweeten them in these countries. I think of the incident where the Zimbabwean security service opened at the SIS officer's briefcase and causing a big stir because of diplomatic immunity being breached on the tarmac in Harare airport. But of course, what they found was documents detailing how to nobble the opposition and bring them on side with Britain. Again, the same thing seems to have happened in a swathe of Arab countries. Do you find it sometimes grating that these orders seem to be going through SIS, which of course use your property, your portfolio as the British ambassador, even at the same time as perhaps the desk officers or the country officers you're working with are probably well-meaning people?
I used to value highly the input of SIS during my time. My colleagues in the embassy gave me some ammunition to use with London to try to persuade London to be more understanding, empathetic towards the Assad regime in its fight at that time against terrorism. And we did receive considerable counter-terrorism cooperation. But never forget that deception is part of the stock in trade of all the intelligence agencies. Their job is not just to provide objective information, but to doctor that information. And they're not subject to any very great scrutiny. And so if the leadership from the political top is not on the ball, then the loose cannons in the intelligence agencies will tend to run with their own agenda. And this appears to be more the case today than with dodgy dossiers and now abusive use made of intelligence in the case of the alleged chemical attack in Idlib, and I find it quite deplorable.
One of the particular indications we seem to be getting of a clique running away with our Syria policy is that noises are now being made that Mrs Assad, who was born in Britain, and if anyone hasn't listened to her speak, they perhaps should, because she's a very softly spoken lady with a British accent and a good deal of sense, as far as I'm concerned. Suggestions are coming out of London, but not necessarily out of the correct officials whose remit it is, that she should be stripped of her passport. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have several thoughts, as you can imagine. The first is that the people who've been advocating this are posturing political pygmies. One or two MPs whose names don't deserve to be mentioned here, who don't have a clue about what's going on in Syria and have no idea, in particular, about the position of women in Syrian society. I think perhaps they prefer that Arab women should all be closeted away, like the people in, like the women in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. Unfortunately for them, the educated women of Syria are almost, to a woman, pro-regime. Again, this gets airbrushed out of the picture. I think these political pygmies prefer their Arab women to be seen and not heard.
We've talked a little about Syria, and I'd also like to talk somewhat about the culture of the Foreign Office and how that's evolved for good and ill, perhaps, over the decades. I started meeting former ambassadors of some distinction even when I was at school, because I had a quite privileged schooling at the boarding school. So I noticed of the generation who were in service after the war that there was a great deal of, you could say, self-assurance, bordering on the cocksure. Sometimes they would be called arrogant. I think they probably knew what they were doing, though, but there was an open sense that ambassadors were in control of foreign policy in those days. I interviewed for the school magazine Sir Frank Roberts just before his death. In fact, he was not just an ordinary knight, he was a GCMG, which is a Knight Grand Cross in the most distinguished order of St. Michael and St. George. That's the way that our top ambassadors used to go around the world with great titles. And he made no bones in the interview I gave in a school magazine. I took from him in the school magazine in the 90s that he was setting British policy towards Germany, and to some extent even steering Willy Brandt, who was Chancellor of West Germany at the time. Sir Percy Craddock gave a talk at Cambridge I attended where he said, well, there was a group of us as young mandarins in the 50s who knew, it was a bit arrogant, I thought, but he said it. He said, we knew that we needed to be in the European Union. The government was not so sure, so we decided to steer them towards that. So a great deal of aplomb and panache involved there, even if you might disagree with the policy decisions they had. Another one I think of is Sir Brian Fall, a former HMA, Her Majesty's Ambassador in Moscow, who was appointed special representative of the British government to Georgia in the years I was working on Georgia. And there I think you see some degeneration, because he looked through me like I was something the cat dragged in when I was at an expert level meeting with him sitting there once, and I thought that was just a one-off. And I then went back to GCHQ and told a good colleague of mine, and he then came back the next month, who'd had a similar meeting in London, and said, do you know that Sir Brian Fall looked right through me as if I wasn't there? That there was clearly a kind of superior to thou attitude among some of the ambassadors. Did you ever rub shoulders with such?
Yes, but equally there were some very good people, particularly among senior Arabists. People still alive today and adorning the benches of the House of Lords, such as Lord Wright, who joined me a few months ago in writing a letter to the Times deploring our Syria policy. There have always been a mixture of characters in the Foreign Office, but don't forget that coming out of the war, there was a big influx from the armed services. And they brought some of their autocratic traditions with them. But what has remained, certainly, is a mindset on the part of a mandarinate that they know best. And in fact, what we have here is the deep state. This is part of the British manifestation of the deep state, of the security establishment, which is headquartered in places like the Foreign Service, the Security Services, the Ministry of Defense, the Home Office, aided and seconded by allies in the mainstream media. And these constitute what I insist on calling the deep state. We like to think that the deep state only works in places like Turkey and Syria and Egypt. Wrong. We are seeing, even in Washington today, call it the Washington establishment, call it the deep state. But what we have witnessed in Washington in recent weeks has been a putsch putsch, a coup, a quiet coup on the part of the deep state to take back control from the inner Trump team of the levers of power and re-establish the values and the ambitions of the deep state. In Britain, the deep state, the closest thing they have to a religion is a belief in Europe. And I am quietly confident that the deep state will make sure that Brexit will never actually happen.
I think in that we are thoroughly at one with your analysis. That's the angle we take on UK column news day after day, and we're able to furnish quite a lot of evidence in that regard. What role is played by language knowledge in the decline of sensible diplomacy? It's a English-speaking problem, of course. It's as pronounced in Australia and America as it is in Britain. But in your day, you were able to study Arabic both in Britain and in country, I think in Riyadh, before you got any of your diplomatic posts to the Arab world. And that Arabic language perhaps has come in even more useful in your latter years with UNRWA as an international civil servant than it has when you were in the service, when you could have used the services of an interpreter, either British or Bahraini or Syrian at any time. Yet that option is not available now to younger diplomats if they perhaps didn't even have much German or French at school, certainly not Latin, so they haven't got their heads around grammar. By the time they leave university. That leaves them surely at a disadvantage that they can't even use rudimentary French to talk to counterparts whose English is not good, whereas at the same time their Russian, continental European and Arab partners, counterparts are able to speak fluent English, French and whatever else.
Yes, the decline of language learning in the FCO is part of the general downward slump in standards. When I learned Arabic, the Foreign Office had its own small school in Beirut, and very good it was. We had near total immersion for the best part of a year. But it's not just the language that one imbibes, it's the culture, and you develop some empathy, some deeper understanding, probably greater than if you study in London or wherever. Let me mention that this loss of expertise particularly applies to Syria. You know, we broke off relations with Syria 6 years ago. That means that a whole generation is lost. There is not one person dealing with the Syria file in London today who has any first-hand experience of work in Syria or who knows the Syrian government figures. They might know one or two of the opposition who base themselves in cafes in Istanbul, but they don't have the slightest feel for how figures in the Syrian government think, nor do they want to have such a feeling.
The kind of stopgap solution that the office had from, I suppose, the late 90s until recently to compensate for this lack of fluency in language and culture among the ambassadors and the desk officers was to fall back on the research analysts. My counterparts would be the Eastern Research Group, who were mentioned in a parliamentary committee report recently because an academic at Birmingham was saying it was risible that half a dozen of them were trying to cover 12 countries. They do it extremely well with very few people. They seem to be resigning or being sacked and not replaced. Your equivalent section would be MENAG, the Middle East and North Africa Research Group. Did you see them dwindle and be overtaxed, as I did with the Eastern Research Group, to the point where some of them were almost burning out and resigning in despair at having to work 12-hour days answering basic cultural and translation questions which the desk officers couldn't answer anymore?
Yes, I think the process was beginning in my time. The expertise was withering on the vine. But I'm afraid it's worse than that. There is a disdain for expertise, for actual knowledge, because someone who actually understands the dossier might have a different view. And I'm sure this is particularly the case on Syria. Almost anyone who doesn't have bias when they come to look at the Syria file will see that our government have been driven by considerations that have no bearing on British interests. Syria has never been a threat to this country. On the contrary, in my time, the government were active allies in the area of counter-terrorism. But now, thanks to our policy, it's become a breeding ground for jihadis, many of them returning to this country.
I'd like to have a look at some of the riposts which some ambassadors leaving post have written in valedictory telegrams, which have been leaked or even made or even been declassified by the government itself in recent years, to show that you're not alone. Perhaps you're more outspoken than many other former ambassadors and others of similar rank, but you're not alone in your thoughts. The first of them is not even a valedictory, but it's a confidential telegram which got leaked in 2004 from Tashkent, from Craig Murray, who wrote this telegram memorably beginning, "We are taking intelligence received under torture from the Uzbeks via the US. We should stop." I remember reading that and almost spitting my tea out and falling off my chair. I expect you had a similar reaction when you read it. And the key paragraph there was, 16 months ago, so he's talking about before the Iraq invasion at that point, it was difficult to argue with SIS, and by which I think he means the clique, in the area of intelligence assessment. But post-Butler, after the Butler inquiry, the first of the questionable inquiries into Iraq, we know not only that they, the clique, can get it wrong, but that they have a particular yen for highly coloured material which exaggerates the threat. That is precisely what the Uzbeks give them, Murray said. Furthermore, MI6 have no operative within 1,000 miles of me, and certainly no expertise that can come close to my own in making this assessment. It took me years to give the man a fair hearing for what he was writing there, because at the time, I remember that was my immediate section, we all thought, how dare the man, damn traitor, etc. And then, of course, he somewhat shot himself in the foot by having a not very above-board personal life at the time, and then by going into radical Scottish nationalism as perhaps his solution to the cognitive dissonance he'd been living with for many years. But he's writing in the midst of a career at that point in absolute frustration that he's not being listened to. The government is not even making any sensible analysis of the situation. Okay, the decline of expertise you just mentioned is one of the factors, but where is the pressure coming from at this point that intelligence clearly obtained under torture and clearly useless as well as immoral intelligence must be used?
I saw Craig Murray's valedictory when I was in post, and I could hardly believe my eyes. I thought I was full of admiration. It was a kamikaze valedictory, but clearly spoken from the heart and expressed inimitably in Craig's style. In a way, he has inspired me. But I think that we always tend to forget the lessons of Iraq. At the moment with Syria, we are like sheep with a particularly severe case of amnesia. We just haven't remembered the lessons of Iraq, how they got the intelligence wrong, how they were convinced by the case. You'll remember the dodgy dossier. You will remember Colin Powell at the Security Council brandishing diagrams, plans, pictures, videos. They had massive evidence, and it all mounted up to a row of beans. And so it is with the current claims about the Assad government's use of chemical weapons in Syria. The evidence, it doesn't add up currently to a row of beans. I can't rule it out, but then I can't rule out the Syrian government's own explanation. And indeed, although the forensic evidence it simply isn't there because impartial inspectors have not been able to carry out forensic investigations. The circumstantial evidence certainly points away from the Syrian government, which had nothing to gain.
You put that all quite concisely when you told the BBC last week, when you were asked why aren't you on board with Sir Michael Fallon, the Defence Secretary. He believes all the government line. You said, well, I don't leave my brain at the door in analytical situations. And I think that's probably what's being expected of us now. But there is a wider cultural problem. We've talked about it already, but some of the valedictories of recent years point to it. What is it that Britain, now where we hardly have a Royal Navy to protect our values, what can ambassadors and Britain generally do in societies which are deeply sceptical that we have much to offer, have serious reservations about the values we are projecting these days, or our ability to sell them anything good? What is a positive thought for what ambassadors and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office can bring to radically different societies with troubled relationships with Britain?
It's difficult to say. I mean, I wouldn't start from this starting point where we have reached now. I'm afraid we've lost so much credibility. Nevertheless, there is still a myth abroad in the world that British diplomats are the best in the world, and I've come across this even in recent times. These myths die very hard. So we do still have a fund of respect and admiration to draw on, not to mention the James Bond legend with regard to our so-called intelligence. But what we've lost is the moral sense. Britain is best when leading from an ethical standpoint, which I argue we did in 2013 when Parliament, not government, Parliament dug its heels in and refused to go along with the warmongers. We stopped Parliament stopped war in its tracks in 2013, and it forced the Americans to follow suit. This is the first occasion, probably since the end of the Second World War, when Britain actually stopped America plunging into a war. I think that's rather admirable, and that is the tradition that our diplomacy should be tapping into. Sadly, the Labour Party at the time took fright at its own success in this, and Ed Miliband almost became apologetic for having stopped a war. I'm hoping that the Labour Party can rediscover the power of moral leadership.
I think one of the reasons why our ambassadors can be more outspoken is that they are career diplomats. The United States, I think it was in the Reagan era, switched to a model of making ambassadorships, particularly the plum ones, rewards for donations to the president's campaign, so that they are rather more supine and the administration has more control over them. We do have potential, as you said, for ambassadors to speak up and to speak sense, perhaps more than American ambassadors in many cases, because our ambassadors have more background. But I do also see a bit of a trend of going native among ambassadors. I think particularly of Paul Brummel, who unusually served in 2 Central Asian stands, and then rather poor form, according to some, wrote the travel guide, the Brad travel guide to Turkmenistan, with a large section in the back using his old contacts to say, here's how you get a visa. And then, of course, the HMA Beirut, who left in 2015, Tom Fletcher, sort of sneakily revived the tradition of writing valedictories, which had been banned 9 years previously, but he did it by writing a blog, something that diplomats would have probably been instantly sacked for in previous eras. So he turned himself almost into the superstar of the piece by saying, I really want Lebanon to have a great future, now I'm leaving it. And Lebanese were almost saying, yes, we want Fletcher in Lebanese politics. There was also the McLaren who left Tbilisi. He was the clan chief of the McLarens, and he was supposed to follow the FCO tradition and just get out of the country when he had finished his post. But he stayed behind and pursued business interests in Georgia, something the Georgian ambassador had done a few years earlier in London and been severely criticised for. So there does seem to be a lack of integrity creeping in at the margins. I have some respect for some of the men I just mentioned, by the way. They wrote in a very witty and incisive style, but they seem to have less of a sharp sense than men like you or your generation of what you do when your post comes to an end.
Yes, it's nothing new, of course. there's been a long tradition of former ambassadors, particularly those in the Gulf, when they retire, finding themselves in positions where they receive their rewards from the Gulf governments. I think when many of our former ambassadors get questioned in the media, they should be asked to make a declaration of interest, whether they are in some shape or form on the Saudi payroll or the Qatari payroll in particular. It could be very interesting. I am on nobody's payroll. It costs me money to advocate for Syria. No one can accuse me of being on the payroll, and that is not true of most of the people who criticize me.
So in closing, I'd like to take the opportunity to ask you something about the British government, particularly in light of the snap elections, which have just unexpectedly been called. Do you think that Mrs May has actually changed the British government's relationship with Syria and with the combatant parties in Syria as a kind of side effect of having called a general election?
Well, I think Mrs May is taking a bit of a risk because if trouble blows up in Syria between now and the 8th of June, she could be in trouble herself. We got a little taste last week of what mild war fever looks like in this country, and it dominated everything else, even though Britain was not directly involved. But imagine a scenario in which the jihadis create another incident involving chemical weapons. In no time, Donald Trump will have loosed off a salvo of many more than 59 missiles, and we could be in an extremely dangerous situation with Britain being asked to chime in. That could seriously affect the election, because the Conservatives will appear, as they always do, appear as the war party, and the Labour Party will come across as the peace party.
That's a very interesting analysis, and it's not just a question of the general election. There's also the question of how our apparent leaving of the European Union is going to affect matters. Are you seeing any indications already of what diplomatically a post-EU Britain and a post-Britain EU will be like? Will there be a change in shall we say, emphases and diplomatic goals, particularly by the EU?
Absolutely. It was very interesting at last week's G7. Boris Johnson, having trumpeted that he was going to get everybody to agree to impose stiffer sanctions on Russia and Syria, failed, in particular because he failed to carry Germany and Italy and the representative of the EU, Mogherini. And he no doubt failed in part because of the bitterness that he personally had created in Europe over Brexit. What goes around comes around, and this was payback time for the Europeans to put their boot into the evil Boris. But it goes deeper than that. I think what we may have seen is a glimpse of what a Europe without Britain will look like. And it's a rather Gaullist Europe, one which is prepared to take a stand slightly different from that of the United States. I think we can look forward to seeing an EU freed from the dragging anchor of Britain, which will be more independent.
Peter Ford, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today, and particularly to get your thoughts on how things may turn out from this point forward. You're very welcome to come back on UK Column News or Insight Vox in the future, and I think we will be asking you thoughts on subsequent developments. Have you any closing thoughts?
Just one crumb of comfort that I derived from last week's excitement about Syria. An opinion poll in this country showed that the country was more or less evenly divided between those who opposed Trump's strikes and those who supported. I think that after a week in which the mainstream media had done its very best to brainwash people, that this rather showed how the common sense of the British people, perhaps encouraged by a few lone voices like my own, could actually see through what they're trying to push down our throats, which is more war.